In the spring of 2014, wrecking crews moved into a small town in Pennsylvania to demolish the most famous chocolate factory on Earth. For over a century, this building had perfumed the entire valley. People said you could smell the town before you could see it. Warm, sweet, unmistakable. Generations of workers had walked through its doors, and billions of chocolate bars had rolled out of them. Now the machines tore through brick and steel, floor by floor, until almost nothing remained. Almost. Because the crews had strict orders, 2 towering smokestacks with 6 white letters running down their sides were not to be touched. The factory could fall. The name had to stand. To understand why, you have to know a secret so strange that when it finally leaked, people refused to believe it. The man who built this factory, the town around it, and one of the great fortunes in America, had quietly signed all of it away decades earlier, at the very height of his power. He told almost no one. He kept coming to work as if nothing had happened, and for 5 years, not a single person outside his inner circle had any idea that the Chocolate King owned almost nothing at all. The world found out by accident, and the reason behind it is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of American business. This is the story of Milton Hershey. It begins, like a lot of great American stories, with failure. In his case, quite a lot of it. Milton Snavely Hershey was born in 1857 on a farm in Derry Township, Pennsylvania, to 2 parents who could not have been less alike. His mother, Fanny, was a stern Mennonite who believed in work, thrift, and plainness.
His father, Henry, was a dreamer who chased one glittering scheme after another and failed at nearly all of them. The family moved constantly, chasing Henry's next big idea. Milton's education died somewhere in the chaos. He never got past the 4th grade. At 15, he was apprenticed to a candy maker in Lancaster, and something clicked. The boy could not spell, but he could taste. He understood sugar the way some people understand music. At 18, he struck out on his own. A candy shop in Philadelphia, opened during the Great Centennial Fair of 1876. He worked himself nearly to collapse for 6 years. It failed. He followed his father west to Denver and took a job with a local confectioner. And there, in that workshop, Milton Hershey learned the single most valuable lesson of his life. The candy maker made his caramels with fresh milk, not the cheap substitutes everyone else used. Fresh milk made caramel that was richer, smoother, and kept far longer. Milton tucked that secret away and tried again. Chicago. Failed. New York City. Failed so completely that he came home to Lancaster with nothing, and some of his own relatives, tired of bailing out Hershey men, wanted little to do with him. He was almost 30, twice bankrupt, a 4th grade dropout in a borrowed workroom. And this is the moment the story turns, because Milton Hershey went back to the one true thing he knew: fresh milk. The Lancaster Caramel Company started with Milton cooking at night and his mother and aunt wrapping candies by hand. Then one day, an English importer tasted those fresh milk caramels and placed an order so large, Hershey had to beg a bank to finance it. The caramels sailed, and the failure of the family became, within a few years, one of the largest caramel makers in America, with 1,000 workers and factories in multiple cities. Milton Hershey was finally rich, and this is precisely when he decided to walk away from all of it. In 1893, he visited the World's Fair in Chicago, where a German company had set up a working exhibit of chocolate-making machinery, great steel rollers and grinders turning roasted cocoa beans into a smooth, dark river. Hershey stood and watched that machinery the way other men watched the fair's Ferris wheel. The story goes that he turned to his cousin and said the caramel business was only a fad. Chocolate, he said, was permanent. He bought the machines before the fair closed, shipped them to Lancaster, and started learning chocolate from scratch. Then he did something that made businessmen up and down the East Coast shake their heads. In 1900, he sold the Lancaster Caramel Company, the source of everything he had, for $1 million. He kept only the chocolate equipment and the right to keep making it. At the time, fine milk chocolate was a European luxury, a Swiss secret, handmade and priced for the wealthy. Hershey's idea was almost offensive in its simplicity. Take the aristocrat of candies and make it so cheap that a schoolchild with a nickel could buy it. But to do that, he needed one ingredient in almost unimaginable quantities: milk, fresh milk, oceans of it, every single day. So instead of building his factory in a city, near workers and railroads and banks, Hershey went home. He bought up dairy farmland.
People thought he had lost his mind. A chocolate palace in a cow pasture, they said? Who would work there? Who would even find it? While the walls went up, Hershey attacked his real problem. Nobody in America knew how to make milk chocolate that could sit on a shelf. The Swiss guarded their methods like state secrets. So Hershey did what he always did: trial and error. Batch after batch, month after month, in a process his own men described as equal parts chemistry and stubbornness, he worked out a way to condense fresh whole milk and marry it to chocolate without spoiling. What came out of those experiments had a flavor all its own, slightly tangy, faintly sour, in a way European chocolate never was. Food scientists today suspect his milk process actually broke down some of the milk fat, creating that sharp little note by accident. It didn't matter. Within a generation, that accident became the very definition of what chocolate tasted like to 100 million Americans. To this day, some Europeans find a Hershey bar strange, and to this day, many Americans find European chocolate somehow not quite right. Both of them are tasting the ghost of Milton Hershey's kitchen. The nickel Hershey bar hit the country like weather. It was everywhere. Train stations, drugstores, lunch pails, coat pockets. For decades, Hershey spent almost nothing on advertising. He didn't need to. The bar advertised itself, 5 cents at a time, millions of times a day. In 1907 came a small foil-wrapped drop of chocolate. The company called it a kiss. Why exactly? Nobody can say for certain. One theory holds it was the sound the machine made, a little.
The paper plume came later, in 1921, when machines took over the wrapping from human hands. And around the factory, something even stranger was rising: a town. Company towns were nothing new in America, and most of them were quiet little tyrannies. Rented shacks, company scrip, padlocked gates. Everyone remembered Pullman, the Chicago rail town whose workers rose up in fury in the 1890s. Hershey had watched all that, and he built the opposite. Real houses with lawns that workers could own. Tree-lined streets named Chocolate and Cocoa Avenues. Schools, a bank, a department store, a trolley system, a free park with a carousel, then a zoo, then gardens. The town had almost everything. What it had most of all was him. Milton Hershey decided nearly everything, down to the architecture. It was generous and it was total. A benevolent kingdom is still a kingdom. Remember that. Instead, in 1909, Milton and Kitty quietly signed a deed creating a school, a home and a school for orphan boys, boys with no fathers, boys like the ones Milton might have become if his own luck had broken slightly worse. It opened in the very farmhouse where Milton had been born, with 4 students. Kitty's health, meanwhile, was failing. A creeping illness the doctors could never fully name slowly took her strength, then her legs. Milton took her around the world chasing cures. In 1912, during one European trip, he paid a deposit to sail home on a magnificent new ocean liner. Business called them back early, and they crossed on another ship instead. The liner they skipped was the Titanic. The canceled deposit check still sits in the company archives. 3 years later, in March of 1915, Kitty died. She was 42. Milton never remarried. For the rest of his life, those close to him said he kept fresh flowers beside her portrait. He was 57 years old, one of the richest men in America, with no wife, no children, and no heirs. What he did next, he did in near total silence. In November 1918, days before the end of the First World War, Milton Hershey walked into his offices and signed over essentially everything he owned. His entire holding of Hershey Chocolate Company stock, control of the company itself, a fortune worth around $60 million then, well over $1 billion in today's money. All of it went into the trust of the little orphan school. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no newspaper story. The most valuable gift in American history to that point simply happened, in ink, in private. And then Milton Hershey put on his coat and went back to work, running a company he no longer owned, for boys who had no idea they owned it.
The secret held for 5 years. In 1923, a New York Times reporter digging through financial records stumbled onto something that made no sense.
The controlling stock of one of America's great companies was registered not to a tycoon, not to a bank, but to a school for orphans. He pulled the thread, and the story broke across the country. The Chocolate King had given it all away, and nobody had noticed. When reporters finally asked him why, Hershey waved it off with words to the effect that he had no heirs, and the boys could put it to better use than he could. If the story ended there, it would be a fairy tale. It doesn't, and it isn't. The next 20 years tested the kingdom and its king in ways that reveal the whole man. When the Great Depression struck, Hershey, now in his 70s, refused to let his town starve. He launched a building campaign that bordered on the irrational, a grand hotel on a hilltop, a community center of marble and limestone, a theater, a sports arena with a vast concrete roof. The town swears no Hershey worker was laid off for lack of work in those years, and it still tells the story, true or polished, of the day Mr. Hershey watched a steam shovel digging the hotel foundations and told the foreman to get rid of it because a machine did the work of 40 men, and he wasn't trying to save money, he was trying to keep men fed. But paradise had a flaw, and in 1937 it split open. A new national union movement reached Hershey, and hundreds of workers staged a sit-down strike inside the plant. The chocolate lines stopped. And here, the town's strange design turned on itself, because when the factory stopped buying milk, thousands of local dairy farmers watched their livelihoods sour by the hour.
On the 6th day, a crowd of farmers and loyalist workers stormed the factory and dragged the strikers out. It was ugly. Men were beaten in the shadow of the smokestacks, in the sweetest town in America. The utopia survived, but the spell was broken, and within a few years, Hershey workers had a real independent union. It is the most uncomfortable chapter in the story, and it is also the most honest one. Milton Hershey had built a kingdom kind enough that people fought, literally, over what it owed them. Then the world went to war again, and the old man's chocolate went with it. The army came to Hershey with a bizarre request. They needed a chocolate bar that wouldn't melt in a soldier's pack in the tropics, packed with calories, and crucially, one that tasted only a little better than a boiled potato. That phrase was in the specification. If it tasted good, soldiers would eat it as a snack. It needed to be survival, not pleasure. Hershey's chemists delivered exactly that, the field ration D. Soldiers grumbled about it in every theater of the war, carried it everywhere, and lived on it when nothing else was left. Hershey's plants poured out ration bars by the billion, and the government pinned award after award on the factory in the cornfield. Milton Hershey lived just long enough to see the war won. He died in October 1945, at 88. The man who had built a chocolate empire, a town, a Cuban sugar kingdom with its own electric railway, and one of the great fortunes of his age, left behind a personal estate so modest it startled the lawyers. He had given nearly all of it away decades before, and spent his last years, contentedly, as the richest poor man in America.
Here is where the story stops being history, because the strange machine Milton Hershey built in secret is still running. That little orphan school is now the Milton Hershey School, home to some 2,000 children in need, boys and girls, and its trust is worth on the order of $17 billion, among the richest schools of any kind on the planet. And that trust still holds controlling power over the Hershey Company. Every bar, every kiss, every wrapper on every shelf on Earth still structurally works for the kids. The town found out what that means in 2002 when the trust's managers moved to sell the company to the highest bidder, with offers climbing past $12 billion. And the town that Milton built rose up. Workers, alumni of the school, residents, and finally the state's own attorney general fought the sale in the open and won. The company stayed. The kingdom, it turned out, could defend itself. 10 years later, the original factory's time finally came. Chocolate making moved to a modern plant on the west side of town. It never left Hershey, Pennsylvania. It just moved up the road. And in 2014, the wrecking crews arrived at 19 East Chocolate Avenue, where the smell of a century still hung in the walls. They took the factory down, and they left the smokestacks standing, 6 white letters tall against the Pennsylvania sky, because some names are not really names anymore. They're promises. so the next time a Hershey bar snaps in your hand or a foil kiss unwinds between your fingers, remember what you're actually holding. A recipe born of 2 bankruptcies and a borrowed kitchen, a flavor created by accident and beloved by a continent, and a secret signed quietly in 1918 that turned every chocolate bar in America into a scholarship.
Milton Hershey failed at almost everything until he was 30. Then he built an empire and gave it to children he would never meet and told no one. The factory is gone. The secret is still keeping its promise.